Good afternoon. Welcome to the Fall Release 2020 webinar brought to you by AIA Contract Documents. This webinar is going to be focusing on residential documents, specifically B109, B509, and B107. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to go through a few administrative items before we get started. This presentation is protected by U.S. and international copyright laws. Reproduction, distribution, display without written permission is prohibited. Now, this program is registered with the AIA for one learning unit. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters to introduce themselves and get started.
Well, thank you very much, Hasi. My name is Mike Koger. I am a director and counsel with AIA Contract Documents. I've spent the last 7 years working with AIA and working with a fine group of other attorneys and also with a great group of documents committee members who are really the secret ingredient to making the AIA's contract documents as good as they are. I started my career as an architect, worked for a handful of years out in San Diego doing architecture before switching careers a bit and practiced in private practice as an attorney for the first 3 or 4 years of my practice as an architect before moving on over to the American Institute of Architects. So I'm happy to talk with you all about some of the newer contracts that we're going to be producing this year and that should be available in your AIA software right now. Jimmy, you want to tell folks a little about yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So as Mike said, my name is Jimmy Germano. I'm also an attorney working in the AIA in the contract documents section. Before I started working at the AIA, I was a construction litigator in private practice in the DC area, representing pretty much everyone up and down the construction project chains, owners, developers, contractors, subcontractors, and some architects as well. I came over to the AIA and I work, in addition to what Mike said, I work with the Contract Documents Committee, bringing these contracts on their updated cycle, bringing them to life, and making sure we have good, fair, and balanced contracts. And with that, Mike is going to give you a little bit of a background of the Contract Documents program before we get into the substance of our fall release. Mike?
Excellent. Thank you, Jimmy. Yeah, so just for a few minutes before we start talking about specific contracts, I want to tell you about the AIA's approach and in creating documents and updating our documents. As many of you who are listeners will probably know, we have been creating at the AIA standard form documents since 1888. That's 132 years worth of experience creating standard form contracts. And the library of AIA contracts has grown significantly and has evolved since those early days to include things like design build documents, construction manager documents, sustainability documents. So basically, anytime the industry has evolved, we've evolved right along with it and tried to remain in lockstep and try to provide guidance to really everybody involved in the construction and design industry. We are guided by our AIA Documents Committee. This is a standing committee that has been around since 1887. That is a collection of architects, all of whom are in good standing with the AIA. Who actually work to create the AIA contract documents and also, of course, update the AIA contract documents. And while each one of our members is an AIA member and is an architect, they do practice in a variety of fields when actually out in practice. So some of them work for contractors, some work for owners, many of them work in private practicing architects as well, of course. We try to update our documents every 10 years, and I believe the documents, all the ones we're going to talk about today, are being updated on their 10-year cycle. And we also try, as Jimmy mentioned, as best as we can to make our documents as fair as possible. So when you get an AIA document, hopefully the goal that we have is when you open it up and you read through it, it's not slanted in favor of any one contracting party. We try to put risk on the parties that are in a best position to control that risk and to manage it. That is one of our drafting processes. And also, we do take a long time sometimes to create documents. It might take us upwards of a year and a half to create any document that gets published. And that's because we are doing, as a background matter, we're doing a considerable amount of market research. We are reaching out to industry stakeholders. We are getting input from everyone in the industry who might have some sort of input or might be affected by our documents. So Jimmy, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. I think you're going to start talking about our first document. I believe it's the B109.
Definitely. Thanks, Mike. One thing I would add to this overview slide is there's a sort of a nuance to the iterative drafting process that in drafting these contracts and updating them, we consider sort of, if you want to think of it, all of the feedback that we've received from courts, from administrative decisions, industry decisions, and also individuals over the course of the last decade when we update these things. So don't ever hesitate if if you're reviewing a contract and you think something doesn't work, or you think there's a nuance that you'd like to see differently, or a perspective or something like that, definitely let us know. And the contact information is at the end of this presentation. We save all of that and we factor all of that in during the next round of revisions. And that's something that I certainly didn't have a full appreciation of before I started working at the AI, when I was just in private practice as an attorney, and something that I think is really valuable. And the more people know about it, I think the better. So just wanted to throw that out there as kind of a pitch. And with that, let's go ahead and get into the substance. So the first contract we're going to talk about today is the B109, which has a mouthful of a title, but it is the standard form of agreement between owner and architect for a multifamily residential or mixed-use residential project. I'm going to talk about some of the, just kind of an overview of this document. Some of the things that I'm going to talk about during the overview are carryovers from the last version, which was in 2010. And some are new, and I'll try and highlight which ones are new and which ones are old in case you have a working familiarity with this document already. And then I'll go into some of the specific nuances and some of the more significant changes that were made to this document. So just to give you a bit of an overview, this document, the B109, it's designed to be used on multifamily residential or mixed-use residential projects. And in basic terms, when most people hear that phrase, multifamily residential, mixed-use residential, they might immediately start to think condominiums. The B109 is specifically and actually explicitly not intended for use on a residential construction project that will include a residential condominium. And it's important to understand. I'll explain how that works later on in a subsequent slide. But it's important to sort of keep the nuance, to understand that nuance and to keep them separate in your minds a little bit. So, an example of when the B109 would be appropriate when you're not talking about condominiums would be, like a low-rise mixed-use project. So around DC, you're seeing like town centers pop up all over the place in the surrounding suburbs. And they might have the first floor is, mixed use. It's going to be some restaurants and some retail space, and then maybe there's a 3 or 4 story high rise sits on top of it, and that's all apartment buildings, something like that. So when you're talking multifamily residential, mixed use residential, those are the kinds of projects and finished products that we're talking about here, generally when we talk about the B109. The B109 is based upon its predecessor, which was the B109 2010, and it's also based upon the B103 2017. And the reason why that's significant is because the B109, the sort of the backbone of this document is the B103, which is more of your complex projects, which I'm assuming most of you are familiar with. But when the B109 2010 was drafted, obviously the B103 2017 didn't exist yet. It was -7 years old at that point. So when the B103 2017 and the rest of the 2017 documents were updated, all of those updates were then incorporated into this new version of the B109. So not only is it based upon its predecessor, but also some of the changes to the B documents in 2017 were incorporated into this new version. It's intended to be used in conjunction with the A201 2017, General Conditions of the Contract for Construction. And I'm assuming it's one of our more popular documents, and most of you are familiar with that one. It, similar to the B103 and I guess the B101, as most of you are probably familiar with, it divides the traditional, services like you're accustomed to seeing into basic and additional. But as I said, it incorporated some of the changes from the B103 that occurred in 2017, and one of those was this new supplemental services category. So it technically has a new supplemental services category, which is new from the B109 2010. But you're probably used to seeing that if you've been using the B documents for a couple of years, at least familiar with that concept. One thing that is almost entirely new, or at least conceptually new and different from some of the other B docs, is the pre-designed services. So we're going to talk a little bit about what those are and why those are needed on these kinds of projects. And those are going to include, just as a preview, assessment of project feasibility, layout, regulatory, etc. So we'll get into a little bit more about how the pre-designed services work, but just to give you an overview. And then lastly, it's important to understand as well that the B109 can be used with a variety of compensation methods, and those include, of course, percentage construction cost, stip sum, and I think there's even ways to kind of work it and massage it a little bit where you can have alternative fee arrangements as well. In some other contracting methods, for example, if you're going to use if you can reference like the A docs, you have the A101, the A102, and the A103, and those are all specific to a type of compensation method, whereas this one is a little bit more flexible in that regard.
Jimmy, do you mind if I jump in and ask you a quick question?
Sure, of course.
So if folks are thinking, they're relatively newcomers to B109, they know our B101 owner-architect agreement because it's been around forever. What are some of the factors that would lead an architect to selecting the B109 over the B101? What are those big issues that it's trying to address? And I don't mean to cut you off. I know you're probably going to get to some of this in a little bit, but like from just a big 30,000-foot view, like what is it about B109 that I should think about using that document for this type of project?
Sure. So a lot of times how this question is answered is actually the B109 it can be used as a sort of bridging document. If you're going to have a condominium project, you can start with the B109, and then we have a condominium guide that walks you through some of those risks. So even though I said the B109 is specifically intended not to be used on condos, and then you might be thinking to yourself, well, I have a condo project, what do I do? The B109 becomes your starting point, and then you tweak it from there to address some of those specific risks. It's also important to understand that the big ticket item is these projects are usually very complex. You're talking different types of construction, when you get into multifamily and mixed use in the same project and perhaps in the same building, you are involving a lot of different project participants that might not be something that's considered when you're talking about a B101, for example. And then lastly, and this is a little bit more specific to condos, but not necessarily, is the final user, the end user, the final owner might not necessarily be the owner with whom the architect contracted initially. So the B109 is set up to address some of those nuances and with respect to maybe handing over the project or different phases of the project, things like that, when you're talking about the complexity involved in these kinds of mixed use and multifamily projects. Does that answer your question?
No, absolutely. And I think you're right. You've kind of described about every project that's going up in the DC area right now.
Yep.
Mixed use projects, they're everywhere.
Yeah, I'm picturing like on the first floor, there always seems to be like a Lululemon and an ice cream store or something like that. And then up on top, you have luxury apartments. Mm-hmm. Let's get in a little bit to the specifics. So the pre-designed services that I referenced a little bit earlier, they're gonna begin before your traditional basic services under the framework of the B109. And like I said, they're going to include assessments of project feasibility, layout, and various regulatory requirements. So how these are designed to be set up is the B109 allows a fill point, and it's in section 3.3. This is somewhat similar to what you may be used to seeing in the B101, for example. But the architect is going to attend a maximum of blank meetings with regulatory entities and users, and then it can be up to the parties to decide, okay, how complex is our specific project, and therefore how many of these types of meetings are we anticipating having for our project. And then if we say maybe the answer is 10, that's a reasonable number, and that compensation is therefore included. And then if there's more meetings than that number, so 11 or more, those are going to be compensated. The architect's going to be compensated as set forth in section 12.1.1, and that's set forth in the bottom portion of your screen. So the parties can decide, okay, is it going to be a fixed fee for every additional meeting, or is it going to be some kind of percentage or on a cost reimbursement basis or something like that? Your basic services, of course, they're based upon the 5 traditional phases, so schematic design, design development, construction documents, bidding or negotiation, and then construction. One of the sort of the unique things that you only really appreciate when you step back and take a 10,000-foot view of this document is what's in parentheses after each of those, and that is that they follow sequentially within the contract itself. So if you're relatively new to this contract, these, the AIA contracts perhaps, or just simply these types of more complicated contracts, they're designed to be sort of temporally constructed. And what I mean by that is you can work through Article 4 from 4.2 to 4.3 to 4.4, and it's meant to follow the traditional flow of a construction project, at least from an architect's perspective. So it allows the parties to think about it in such a way that makes sense. So 4.2, and then 4.3, and then 4.4, and down the line. And each of those, not necessarily each of those within your basic services, but certainly carving out pre-design, basic services, ad services, and then that new supplemental services that I referenced earlier. Those can all be compensated separately. So there's different compensation provisions for each of those. So if you might have like you're going to have a relatively complicated pre-design services aspect of this project, but maybe basic services are going to look relatively straightforward, or vice versa, then you can set up the compensation provisions to meet those unique needs for that project. Speaking of supplemental services, if you open up the B109, what you will see is this document, or this table. And this table probably looks familiar to some of you who have seen the B101 in recent years. It is somewhat tweaked from the B101 supplemental services table, but not much. So there's 28, I think, different supplemental services listed in the B109. And when you're filling out this table, it's intended to first, you look at the blank column on the right, and that is the responsibility. So you just fill out whose responsibility that particular supplemental service will be. And then for each of those supplemental services that are listed, again, there are 28 items, that list goes on. For each of those 28 supplemental services that are listed or more, there's an option to add more. The parties have to describe it with either inserting some language within the agreement itself. So in this section 5121 and 5122, or if it's easier, you can just generate an exhibit and attach it. So, for example, if you want to use one of the architect services, the standard form documents that the AIA publishes, you can use that. You can generate your own, or you can just insert language right here within the document itself. And the reason why this is just to provide a little bit more clarity with respect to the supplemental services with each one that's listed in the B109 text itself. With respect to ad services looks relatively similar to the B101, so I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about it, but this is an example of the additional services that are embedded within the B109, and something that is, just sort of to show you an example of what you can expect when you're working through Article 5, the ad services provision, and when you see the sort of the two check marks and then the parentheses at the beginning of each one of those, that is a fill point, and you fill in whatever is appropriate, so a number, an amount, to accommodate the nuances and the specific aspects of your project. This is one of the differences between the B101 and the B109. So cost estimating. In the B109, the architect does not prepare cost estimates. Instead, the architect agrees to design the project to meet the owner's budget for the cost of the work at the conclusion of the design development phase services. So if you're thinking to yourself, well, I have a project that's similar to this, but it's going to include cost estimating, then you may want to look at the B101 to see if that's more appropriate to include that scope of work. Because, as it says on the bottom of the screen, the B109 assumes that the owner will retain third parties to provide cost estimates, project schedules, et cetera, and those consultants with the owner can implement fast track, phase, accelerated scheduling, et cetera. And then all of those sort of underlying assumptions are embedded within the negotiations that go into the B109. And then speaking of consultants, this is another little nuance that's somewhat unique to the B109. And these are additional required consultants. So in developing the language for the B109, these were some of the consultants that are typically required for this project type. So if you're talking about mixed-use multifamily residential, these are the consultants that are typically required for that size of project. So this table is included in section 1.1.14, and it's the same setup as the table that we just described when it came to supplemental services, sort of set up similarly, where the responsibility on the right-hand column is set up to where the parties can select whose responsibility it will be. Claims and disputes. So this is one, again, that might be, it's different from the prior version of the B109, so it bears focusing in on a little bit. So the B109 limitation of liability, which can be negotiated between the parties. Our market research sort of indicated that these were relatively standard in these kinds of projects. So adding standard language was appropriate, but it's important to remember that the limitation of liability is blank. So it leaves the amount to be determined between the parties, and then of course they can always choose not to have a limitation of liability if that's not appropriate for their project. And then lastly, so that section is sort of in the bottom of your screen, 9.1.6, the architect's indemnity obligation, which is 9.1.3, is tied to this final section, which is the stated amount of professional liability insurance coverage required of the architect under this agreement, or the limitation of liability in section 9.1.6, and it's that section that's that sentence that's highlighted on your screen. It's a change from the prior version, this concept, so I would certainly recommend consulting with counsel in licensing your jurisdiction, because indemnity obligation, limitations, liability can be very state specific, and then you can tweak it, of course, to meet the needs of the project and the legal requirements in your particular state. When it comes to compensation, again, we sort of covered this a little bit earlier. Article 12 is going to break down your compensation into multiple different categories. So, like I said a little bit earlier, if you have one, maybe your pre-design services is going to be very complicated and the compensation needs to be set up differently, Article 12 will allow you to do that. And some wrap-up items about this document. So some other provisions, these are going to be structured similarly to your more traditional owner-architect agreements, and that's things like copyright and licenses, your claims and disputes, of course, except what we talked about with respect to the indemnity and limitation liability, and then termination, suspension, scope of the agreement, et cetera. Those are going to be somewhat familiar to you if you're familiar with the other documents that are in the AIA suite, so the B101, B103 specifically. So that covers the B109. Again, a relatively complex document gone through in about 15 minutes or less. So there's way more to it. We're going to talk about a little bit more in going through the B509, and you'll see what I mean as we go through it. But to keep the show moving, the B509 is what we're going to talk about next. So the B509 is the guide for supplemental conditions to the B109 2020 for use on condominium projects. Again, a bit of a mouthful. We just refer to it as the condo guide, and that's what we understand the industry refers to it as well. So like I said earlier, if you're starting with the B109 and you're saying to yourself, well, I'm on a condo project and you told me that the B109 can't be used on a condo project, so what do I do? This is what you do. So the B109 is designed, it's supplementary conditions that are designed to assist parties in taking the B109 and using it for projects that are going to include a residential condominium. So the condo guide, the B509, it serves two specific purposes. First, it's going to provide guidance regarding issues that are unique to condominium construction. And that seems relatively obvious, sort of what I just said. But it's not only guidance, it's also analysis. So you can sort of tell a little bit what I'm talking about when I focus on section 2. It's going to provide model language that may be used to amend or supplement the B109 to tailor it specifically for use on condo projects. So it's going to provide specific language that can be a model language that can be added in or tweaked if you have a condominium project, but then it also includes some analysis as to the reasons or reason why that change might be necessary. So it's helpful even if you don't make the changes that are suggested or use the model language that's suggested. It's helpful because you can go through it and at least understand the risks a little bit better. That's at least the reason why we published the B509. So like I said, the B109 specifically and explicitly is not meant for condo projects. So that's going to be section 2.3. This is from the B109. The owner represents that the project shall not include a residential condominium. So the first thing you want to do, obviously, if you have a condominium project, is strike out section 2.3. And one of the little just sort of logistical nuances when you're editing these agreements is not simply deleting it, but replacing it with the phrase intentionally omitted or deleted or something like that. And the reason why is because if you just delete it, it messes up the numbering throughout the rest of the document. And there are, if you're familiar with the AI's documents, there's cross-references to other sections all over the place and throughout other documents as well. So, you know, for example, I said earlier that the B109 is intended to be used with the A201, the general conditions document. Well, the B109 might have specific references to the A201 and specific provisions that are in there. So if the parties go through the A201 and start deleting and renumbering sections, it could throw off those cross-references. So just kind of a quick practical tip when you delete a paragraph in full to just replace it with the phrase intentionally omitted or something similar to that.
Jimmy, do you mind if I jump in and ask a big picture question?
Sure.
So when I used to work in architecture, I worked for a couple of firms actually that specifically their entire business model, one of their hallmarks of their business model was we do not do condo projects. And of course, we have an entire guide here based on, how to adjust your contracts for condos. I guess, when I think back to those architecture firms I worked for, I think the general feeling was, well, they're just riskier, so we're not going to touch them. Can you maybe talk a little bit about, from an attorney's perspective, why they're riskier and what the big picture of like what you should be concerned about as an architect performing services on a condo project?
Sure, it's a great question. Condos are risky. That's sort of the understatement of the century. But there are some specific risks. So in a couple of slides, I'm going to go through a few of those and how the B509 addresses them. But just kind of big picture, it's important to understand that when you are, and this is something that perhaps younger architects might not grasp yet until maybe they've dealt with a claim or a lawsuit or arbitration or something like that. But most of the risk, and I would say arguably all of the risk on a construction project comes from your contractual obligations. You have one contract with the owner, you know who that owner is, and you contract with them to perform certain services, and you have to meet your obligations under the contract. There's some nuances that come into play when you talk about insurance and standards of care and all that, but just kind of thinking about it big picture, it's you and the owner, and what did you do or what did you not do for the owner? When you start talking about condominiums, the moment that portion of the building, whatever the condominium is, however the condominium association divvies it up, the owner changes. So not only, just sort of speaking practically, not only can you get sued by the owner with whom you had a contract, but if something is incorrect, something is wrong on the project, then there are future owners, and you don't know who those future owners are at the time you're performing your work. So subsequent ownership that is changing just makes it inherently risky from an architect's perspective, particularly when you're dealing with, sometimes you're dealing with condominiums that can have repeat, if there is a mistake, it can repeat itself tens or scores or hundreds of times depending upon how big the building is. If there's like one particular design deficiency in one of the units, and that's just used as a model unit or a typical unit for construction, it can repeat itself, for however many units there are throughout the project if it's just like a typical design. So that's the big, and it's evident in, if any architects from the West Coast are watching, it's the Beacon case out of California is one that really drove home this point. And there's those kinds of decisions in a lot of different states that really hammer home the idea that condominiums are just a risky endeavor. So the upfront contractual negotiations need to be very carefully performed to apportion those risks accordingly. So,
Excellent. Yeah, no, that was perfect.
So getting into the B509 a little bit, the first thing that the B509 does, what you'll notice is there are a list of definitions. There's maybe about a dozen of them. And these definitions can be added in if you're going to use the B109 for condo project, and they add in terms that are specific to the condominium. You want to make sure that these are appropriate for your state and your whatever locality you're in, et cetera. But one of the little, again, logistical nuances to remember is that your edits throughout the rest of the B509, if there's model language that's suggested, that model language assumes that these definitions have already been added in. So you might find model language out, that comes in Article 5 or Article 9, or whatever the case may be, and it's going to refer to the capital C condominium. So you have to add in these definitions first to make sure, again, that everything flows properly. So one of the risks that we talked about a couple of minutes ago is claims from owners, and one of the ways to deal with that risk is through insurance. If an architect is required by the owner to maintain coverage for a specific term beyond a year or two following substantial completion, the architect might insert language in the agreement to clarify that the obligation should only continue if coverage is available at rates similar to those available at the time of entering the owner-architect agreement. So this is the model language in Section 2.7. To account for the risk of fluctuating insurance premiums for things like post-completion insurance coverage. The B509 also discusses, while we're on the topic of insurance, the project-specific professional liability option. They can be quite difficult to obtain, however, if you've dealt with them. They're very nuanced, very specific, and sometimes they're not even available. And if they are available, they're usually very expensive. So if they're not commercially available, it might be something to look into, but it might not be available. If a project-specific policy is contemplated for your particular project, then you should consult with insurance representatives to more fully understand the impact, the limitations, the terms and provisions, et cetera, of those types of policies, again, because they're really nuanced and they can be very expensive. This is an item that's a little bit more subtle. So I want to try and step through it a little bit more carefully. And if you remember the change that I talked about in the B109 about the limitation of liability and the indemnity obligation, what architects should understand is that the stated amount of the professional liability insurance coverage required of the architect under the agreement, that's the phrase out of the B109 when you're talking about indemnity, that's not going to change over the life of the project, but the available insurance proceeds may decrease. So most professional liability insurance policies are eroding policies, which means that costs and expenses that the carrier incurs in defending its insured, so like paying for defense counsel, for example, those are charged against the policy limit, thereby eroding the total amount available to pay for damages under the policy. So, another example would be if the amount of professional liability PL insurance coverage required of the architect under the agreement is equal or close to the total amount of PL coverage carried by the architect, then claims on other projects might also eat into the available coverage and create a deficit between the stated amount of coverage under the agreement and the amount of coverage available to pay for damages. So if those types of reductions occur and an architect finds itself in that situation, then they may be responsible for the difference between the available insurance proceeds and the stated amount of PL insurance coverage required under the agreement. So it's a nuanced issue, but if an architect wants to avoid this potential situation, they can consider replacing Section 913 with the following suggested language, and it's this highlighted amount here. It is similar, but there's a really specific difference that's in there, and it's not stated amount, it's just the amount of architect's available PL insurance proceeds. If you're considering a condo project and making this kind of change, consult with legal counsel and insurance counsel, because the legally sensitive nature of limitation liability provisions, you're always cautioned to consult with counsel as to the specific application of these provisions in your jurisdiction and however they are dealt with. Certain states, for example, require statutory language that can be added to ensure that this type of clause is enforceable. And then when you're determining the appropriate amount to enter into Section 916, you should consider an objective description of a quantifiable sum that's less than the architect's available professional liability insurance proceeds. So now that the dense topic of insurance is done, we can move on to something a little bit more fun, which is post-occupancy site visits. Excuse me, I need to get a drink of water for a second. So site visits can be an important tool for architects, and if architect performs site visits annually on a project following substantial completion, those can mitigate the risk to the architect, but there's also a balance that needs to occur. So for example, the architect should really note in this model language here that their site visit's not going to include invasive testing or testing or observation of areas not readily accessible, etc. And then the B509 also discusses alternative approaches to post-occupancy site visits. So the architect, for example, may want to enter into a separate arrangement to provide ongoing site visits. And there are pros and cons associated with that, again, that are discussed in the B509 if the parties want to investigate that possibility. But again, states' laws can be pretty specific on this topic. So again, consult with counsel just to make sure that these approaches and the language that's added in is effective, particularly as to things like statute of limitations in your jurisdiction. A maintenance manual is a potentially very big issue because failure to provide regular maintenance on building systems, particularly in a condominium, especially if you're talking about elements like an exterior envelope, for example, it's a common source of building failure and therefore potentially claims. So The B509 goes through the nuances of your maintenance manual and suggests adding this type of model language that goes through and requires the owner to prepare and furnish a maintenance manual and then for it to be followed. When I talked about earlier about the maintenance manual, the B509 generally being a good source for number one, model language, and number two, just sort of a general analysis of the issues. This is what I'm talking about. So I just kind of want to show you here what we're talking about. So your model language is going to be at the bottom of the screen, and that's that quote that was on the prior slide. And then the 3 paragraphs above it, it's just an analysis of maintenance manual and those types of issues that might arise with maintenance manual. So even if you decide for your project that a maintenance manual clause is not necessary, the B509 is going to give you some analysis as to why it's something that you should consider and understand the risks associated with it. And then just some miscellaneous issues before we start talking about the B107 and the B509. And I'm not going to go into detail on these because I want to give Mike plenty of time for the B107, but just some other things that the B509 is going to consider. So when the future owners want to do remodeling and renovation, how that works, how the marketing materials should be structured and perhaps signed off on, if there's a termination or a reduction of the architect's construction phase services, how that might work, and some other issues as well. So again, if you're converting the B109 for use on a condo project, check out the B509. We think it's helpful. It's a little dense, and that's the point. It gives you a lot of information that you can use to decide if the model language or if the analysis is appropriate for your project. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Koger to lead the way on a discussion of the B107. Mike?
Thank you, Jimmy. I just have one quick follow-up question for you. Sure. As you were going through the post-occupancy site visit, sure. I was a little bit conflicted on whether or not, as an architect, would I really want to, like, the risk proposition of doing that. On one hand, you get to, and I know you've thought through this with your task group a lot more than I have. On one hand, you get to go out to the site after, folks are actually using it. You get to maybe mitigate some of a problem that you notice. You might be able to notice that there's components of the building that are leaking or there's water infiltration or something. On the other hand, you kind of open up yourself to a potential argument that, well, I did continue to go out to the site. I should have seen, damage or some kind of a problem that was ongoing with the building if something does end up turning up, later on. So I'm just kind of wondering, what were some of the discussions with the group and where obviously you guys came to a conclusion that it was worthwhile to put that in the guide. Any further thoughts on that? Are my fears misplaced, I suppose?
No, I don't think your fears are misplaced. I mean, again, condos are risky for a reason. They have a reputation for a reason. Condominiums, specifically with respect to post-occupancy site visits, for example, that issue specifically, number one, it has to do with the issue you raised, which is whether or not if the architect agrees to go back and perform a post-op site visit, should they have seen an issue, and if so, should they have remedied it? So that's sort of the issue you get into first, and there's dealing with that a little bit in the model language. The other issue, a little bit more nuanced, is your statute of limitations, which was analyzed by the task group. But the thing to remember is most people think of statute of limitations as, well, when I'm done with this project, and usually it's substantial completion, but at some point in time the clock begins to run, and then you have a certain number of years that the owner can bring a claim against you. Well, in some states, there's an argument to be made that if you go back and perform a site visit or perform specific kinds of work, potentially that clock starts over. So if you're doing yearly site visits, then your 3-year clock or your 5-year clock or 10-year clock, whatever it is on your statute of limitations, hasn't even started to run yet because you're going to go back and perform a post-occupancy site visit. Now, that's a super nuanced issue that's very state specific, so look into that for sure, but that's another one of those things that you should consider, the pros and cons of doing a post-occupancy site visit. But there are a lot, as you said, and it's a good analysis to undertake.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I was kind of listening to you and talking through it myself, it's if there is a problem with the building that is something that stemmed from an error or omission of the architect, it's not like you're going to be able to hide from it. You might as well get out there if you can and see it before it manifests into something bigger. So that's why I think I would be inclined to maybe think about adding such a provision into my agreements, because maybe I can mitigate something that long before it actually turns into a bigger problem.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you for a discussion of the condo stuff. I know most people listening to this are probably most interested in that aspect of what we're talking about. I'm now sharing my screen. Jimmy, can you see? I hope you can't see my notes, right? You can just see my actual presentation.
Yep. Yeah, you're good.
Good deal. Okay, so I want to talk maybe about 10 minutes or so about the B107 2020 document. It has a long title. Standard agreement between developer, builder, and architect for prototypes for a 1 or 2 family residential project with limited architectural services. That is quite a mouthful. Okay, and before I go into some specifics about the B107, it is a document that was recently updated this year. I mean, it's published literally this fall. It has been in existence since 2010. So we were just doing an update of that document. But I think it's probably worth taking a look at the big picture landscape of all of the B100 series owner architect agreements that we offer at the AIA. And I think what I have on the screen here is everything. And there's quite a lot of these documents, and it can be kind of confusing to find the right one for your project. We're talking today about 2 documents that are they're fairly niche. They're for a very specific types of projects and engagements. But I wanted to at least show this big landscape picture of everything that we offer. And I'll give you my kind of golden rule for selecting owner-architect agreements, AIA or owner-architect agreements. We really only offer one agreement that is vanilla, that is really a general document that is for basic owner-architect engagements, and that's the B101. That's the one everybody knows, and it's the one that's been around in some form for a very, very long time. I would encourage you to think, unless there is or adapt a strategy that unless there is a good reason, there should be a good project-specific reason to go away from the B101. B101 should really be the way you're kind of starting to think when picking an owner-architect agreement, and then think, well, is there a nuance to my project that I need to maybe address? Something like, as Jimmy mentioned, a condos issue or a mixed-use residential, or what I'm going to talk about here right next is the prototype residential project. That's really the time where you should be kind of moving away from the B101. And if you, to the extent you do move away from the B101 in your owner-architect engagements, always make sure that any of the other B100 series documents you might be picking, read the synopsis, read the instructions. All of those are available free on our website, and also read the sample of the documents, which you can also get on our website, because those are going to clue you in to the very specific scenarios that those non-B101 documents are meant to address. So let's take a look at the actual title of the B107, because there's a lot to unpack here. Anytime you're looking at an AIA document with a very long title, that's probably a really good indicator that it's for a very specific purpose. And B107 is a perfect example of this. Kind of taking it piece by piece, the B107 is an agreement between a developer, builder, and an architect. Normally, on almost all of our other B100 series documents, you're going to see an agreement between owner and architect. In this instance, we're talking about a developer builder, someone who is both a traditional owner and a contractor. So this is somebody who actually has a considerable amount of knowledge about the building industry. This is someone who does not need as much hand-holding through the process as a typical client. Their fundamental needs really are for a basic design and a building permit. This is not the type of entity who's going to need the architect to review applications for payment or to help with procurement or of any of those kinds of things. The next part of the title here is that this is for a prototype for a 1 or 2 family residential project. So imagine the developer builder who is looking for you to do a maybe single family residence or a duplex of some sort, and they're going to create variants of that or literally copy that same design over and over again in one community, or perhaps in a variety of communities all over a city or something. That's a pretty common business model for developers, that they want to get one basic design, and then they might want to change finishes, they might want to change a little bit about that design, but they want to just kind of economize and make their construction process more efficient by using the same design over and over again. So this is for a prototype. And we've also added the phrase limited architectural services at the end to really hope to keep people into this fact that the architect is not going to be providing traditional construction phase services like the reviewing payment applications and the like. I think it's also very helpful to do a bit of a comparison between the B101 and our B107. Both of these documents envision the architect doing schematic design, that traditional first phase of the design process. And after that, things really change. So in a B101, you're going to be doing the traditional 5 phases of design development, CDs, procurement, whatever that might be, assisting with bidding, and then the construction phase services. On a normal B101, there is no right to reuse the architect's design. It is intended for the architect is creating drawings and specifications for one project. And if you want that architect to work on a second project, you need them to pay them to do a whole different design. The B107 is different, of course. The B107 has, beyond the schematic design phase, the architect is going to be creating a permit set, which is something I'll get into in the next slide, but then also doing permitting services, which I think most architects would know what that means. It's responding to building officials' comments and working towards achieving a permit. Also, the B107 has very limited construction phase services, which I'll get into in a moment, but imagine a highly truncated version of what the B101 envisions for construction phase. And of course, that key feature, the right to reuse the design. So as I've mentioned, the goal of the architect services in the B107 is to produce a permit set, which we've defined in section 3.3.2 to be necessary documentation of the design required to obtain a building permit in the jurisdiction in which the project is located. And if you're an architect who's been practicing for any amount of time, you'll know that the level of information necessary to obtain a building permit is far less than the amount of information that will be required to actually build a project. The reason for this is, of course, that building officials, when they're reviewing drawings and specifications to issue a building permit, they're simply looking to verify on some minimal level that the project is code compliant. And frankly, they're not even doing a tremendously detailed review for those issues. The idea here is that after the permit set is developed, there is further development needed in order to actually construct the project, and that's development. That responsibility is going to be taken on by the developer builder in this particular engagement in the B107. Also, of course, in the permitting phase services, the architect is going to be providing responses to review comments. Some folks might wonder, well, why did you separate out the permit set phase services from the permitting phase services? Aren't those kind of connected? They certainly are. I mean, everybody knows you submit a set of drawings to the building department, and then the next thing you do is respond to whatever comments those building officials might have. But from a timing perspective, we wanted to make sure that the architect is able to get paid for the permit set at the time they submit the drawings, and they don't have to delay payment for getting those permit set drawings, getting paid for that work while the building department sits and does their review for a month or two at a time. So that way, due to that reason, we separated these two items out into different phases so that the permitting response and comment period can be a separate phase that the architect will get paid for and doesn't have to wait until all of that is wrapped up before getting paid for the permit set and completing the permit set. Another feature that's important about the B107 is that the architect is going to be responsible For the limited construction phase services, again, this is done with the presumption that the architect's client is someone who's acting as both an owner and a contractor for the project, so the architect does not have to manage that relationship. So it's an easier engagement for an architect in some ways. No assisting with procurement, no preparing or reviewing of bids, no reviewing applications for payment, no inspecting the project for substantial completion or final completion. Again, if this is not describing the situation that you are in as an architect, then you should really be thinking about the B101 or one of our other documents. Site visits, RFIs, and submittals are all done on a highly limited basis, all really just based on the instruments of service that the architect does create, which is that fairly minimal permit set only. A key feature here of the V107 is that the architect is designing a prototype and the developer builder intends to reuse the architect's instruments of service on subsequent residents, usually with slight modifications. Instruments of service, I know I've mentioned that a couple times. It's for those of you who are newcomers to AIA documents, it's a contract language that you'll find in our agreements. It refers to the architect's creative work. I mean, usually we express that as drawings and specifications, but nowadays, of course, that can be BIM models, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the right to reuse the architect's instruments of service is not typical in our V100 series agreements. So this is a very unique right. I think this is the only document that we offer where you're going to find this idea of the owner, the architect's client, the developer builder having a right to reuse the instruments of service. We also say, with or without design modifications, because it is very likely that whenever you're reusing drawings and specifications for another project, you're going to have to modify them in some way. Another important thing to point out here is the right to reuse is contingent upon payment in section 11.9. Because the right to reuse the architect's instruments of service is such a unique right, we've included a handful of ways that the architect can put limitations on that right. For example, the architect may limit the maximum number of subsequent residents that can be built by reusing the architect's instruments of service. You can limit the geographic area where subsequent projects may be developed, or you can put like an end date, that the reuse right expires after 2 years or a certain date certain in the future. Okay, I know I'm running a little bit short on time. I'll speed up a little bit, but I know I already talk fast, so I'll get through as much of this as I can.
That's my fault, sorry, Mike.
No, I kept interrupting you and asking questions, no problem at all. I do want to talk though about modifying the instruments of service. To architects, this is not a minor thing. Modifying the architect's instruments of service, it's one thing for the developer builder to pay the architect to simply reuse the designs on subsequent projects, but buildings aren't designed like automobiles, right? You can't just take drawings and specs usually from one site, use them on another site, and expect that there's no changes. There's always going to be issues out there like site issues, zoning issues, end user needs where you might actually have to do some modifying. So one thing that we have structured in here into this agreement is that if you're an architect and you're going to be doing modifications for a reuse, you should be getting paid additional services. And one example that I was going to give, but I won't because of time constraints here, is I did a project like this in San Diego when I was a very young architect, where we had basically 2 buildings use the same site, same drawings and specifications on both of them. The client paid us very well for the first one, very minimally for the second one. And what we learned was that modifying those drawings and specs for the second project was almost as much work as it was to create them on the first project, because of all of the little oddities, the zoning issues, the site was different, drainage, slope, there was just a million little adjustments. So if you're going to be doing modifications to drawings and specs to modify that prototype for a second site, make sure you're getting paid for it. And there is a mechanism in there in section 11.3, and make sure you educate your clients on those kinds of things, because it might seem like, well, it's a simple thing to just make adjustments to some drawings and to use drawing specifications on a second site. It's not really that easy most of the time. It's been my experience. Really quickly, up to this point, we've talked about the developer builder, but we haven't discussed their role in contractual terms. The B107 places a number of requirements on the developer builder that are not present in our other owner architect agreements. I've already kind of mentioned some of those. The developer builder should be a contractor licensed to perform work in that jurisdiction. They're going to be an entity knowledgeable about building codes, laws, and regulations. They'll be knowledgeable about selecting materials and systems, a lot of which will fall to the developer builder as their responsibility to take that permit set and complete it on out to make to actually constructing the project. Another quick point to make here is that typically in our owner architect agreements, we do not require the owner to actually have any specific insurance. Practically speaking, the owner is almost certainly going to carry property insurance at some point, and perhaps even the builder's risk policy during construction. However, the B100 series agreements don't actually require that of the owner. Here, because the developer builder is required to carry is actually required to carry a number of insurance policies that would be common of a contractor because, of course, the developer builder is acting as the contractor. And if you're an architect, you'll know that the last thing that you want on a construction project is to be the only entity with insurance that can respond to instances that result in a loss. So because the developer builder is acting as a contractor, they'll need to have a contractor's insurance. So simple enough, that's included as a responsibility here. A few odds and ends. I'll just quickly go through those because I think we're nearing the end. But we want to make sure to point out that the project in the B107 is defined as the prototype only. So we want to make a clear distinction between the project that the architect is designing and the reuse or modifications. Those are the key words for subsequent projects. There's also a modified standard of care. I can't believe we've gone an hour and we haven't really talked about standard of care in any of these agreements, but this is one I think that's worth highlighting, that in section 2.2 of the B107, there is a modified standard of care, recognizing the fact that the developer builder is an entity knowledgeable about construction. This is a unique situation where the architect is handing off plans and specifications, just enough to get a permit set out of the building department. The architect is also going to be providing consulting services for MEP, but only to the extent required for the permit set. Again, you're going to be the architect's going to be responsible for structural and MEP and might be hiring consultants. But again, it's only for that minimal level. And then the developer builder, of course, is responsible for completing the development of the design through construction. And with that, for any additional resources, we have all kinds of resources now on our YouTube page. We also have a Learn page on our website, AIA Contract Documents, AIAcontracts.org/learn. If you have questions about content, contact us at docinfo@aia.org and email us for tech support issues at techsupport@aia.org. Thank you, Jimmy, and thank you everyone else for listening to this program. I hope it was useful.